1945, the Third Reich announces its surrender. In its aftermath, Germany lies buried beneath rubble, hunger, and despair. The exact image of a totalitarian dream that had pushed the world to the brink of the abyss. Amid the devastation, a half-destroyed factory in Wolfsburg survives. Its machinery remains intact. Forgotten molds gather dust. And there, resting in silence, stands an unusual automotive design. The Volkswagen Käfer, the Beetle, the people's car. A vehicle born from Hitler's ambition, officially engineered by Ferdinand Porsche, and financed by the Nazi state. Barely produced before the war, it was, at that moment, nothing more than a relic of a defeated empire. But remarkably, it was not the end. After the Allied occupation, British forces took temporary control of the factory, hoping to quickly find a private buyer capable of restoring industrial life. Yet interest was scarce. It wasn't until 1948 that a definitive solution was seriously considered. And among the potential buyers stood Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford II, the grandson of the legendary founder, received the proposal. He reviewed it with his executives and, after a brief deliberation, chose to decline. What did Henry Ford II overlook, underestimate, or simply fail to see when he rejected the acquisition of a factory that would, years later, challenge his own empire? This is the story of how the American giant that defined the automotive industry with the Model T let slip away one of the most formidable competitors of the 20th century. Today, Volkswagen is undoubtedly a symbol of modern industrial capitalism. But its origins were not born from the free market or private initiative. They were born from a deeply ideological political ambition. As Carl Ludwigsen notes in Battle for the Beetle, the so-called people's car was not merely an automotive project. It was a strategic component within the National Socialist apparatus. In 1933, Adolf Hitler rose to power with a clear vision, a Germany that would move forward, quite literally, on wheels. Not only in military terms, but symbolically. The Autobahnen, the sophisticated German highways, were not an exclusive invention of the regime. In fact, some stretches existed before Hitler, but under Nazism, they expanded aggressively and became a political showcase. Roads meant to represent progress, order, and national unity. The next step was to put the population behind the wheel. But there was a problem. The automobile was still a luxury. And ironically, the formula for turning propaganda into real mobility was not in Berlin. It was across the Atlantic. Hitler openly admired what Henry Ford had achieved with the Model T and the assembly line, transforming the automobile into a mass phenomenon and into an unprecedented engine of profitability. If in the United States the democratization of the car had emerged from private enterprise, Germany would attempt to impose it from above, the state not as a partner, but as the architect and owner of the project. Ferdinand Porsche was given the assignment. The vehicle had to be simple, durable, and affordable, capable of carrying a family along the Autobahnen at roughly 100 kilometers per hour without constant breakdowns. The project was named the KDF Wagen, short for Kraft durch Freude, strength through joy, the state program that promised well-being to workers. To bring it to life, in 1938 the regime built a factory in Wolfsburg, and practically an entire city devoted to that promise. The acquisition plan seemed simple. Citizens would purchase savings stamps. Once they completed the required amount, they would receive their car. On paper, the system appeared viable. In reality, not a single buyer received a car before 1939. And when Germany launched its military expansion, the civilian project was pushed aside by rearmament. The people's car was replaced by the vehicle of war. In 1945, the Third Reich collapsed. Germany was a landscape of ruins. Wolfsburg was no exception. And although the factory had suffered heavy bombing, its industrial core surprisingly remained intact. The presses, the molds, and much of the machinery were still standing. Enough for the project not to die with the regime. Up to that point, only a few hundred civilian units had been assembled. The people's car had never truly reached the streets. With the Allied victory, the fate of the factory automatically passed into the hands of the army, occupying the zone, Great Britain. Thus, the KDF wagon, the people's car, was left suspended in a political and industrial vacuum, a moment of uncertainty that pointed more toward dismantlement than continuity. When the British took control of Wolfsburg, the question was not how to save the factory, but whether it should disappear altogether. Many German industrial complexes were slated for dismantling as part of war reparations. In that context, Major Ivan Hurst, an engineer with the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, arrived on the scene. His mission was technical and straightforward: assess assets, catalog machinery, and determine what could be reused. He did not come as a savior, but as an inspector. What he found, however, altered the expected course. Despite the damage, the plant remained functional. A prototype could still start. In a collapsed Germany, where transportation was nearly paralyzed and administrative chaos was constant, that detail proved decisive. The British Army ordered thousands of units for official use. It was not an ideological bet, but a practical solution. Without that initial order, the assembly lines would have fallen silent. For the next 3 years, Wolfsburg operated under military administration. Roofs were repaired, shifts reorganized, and efforts were made to detach production from its National Socialist past. But Britain was facing its own post-war economic crisis. Maintaining a German factory indefinitely was not sustainable. The logical solution was privatization. British companies such as Austin and Morris were approached. Their response was negative. They identified multiple limitations: an outdated design, an uncertain German market, and a strategically uncomfortable location. Wolfsburg lay close to the Soviet zone, and by 1948, the Berlin blockade made it clear that German stability hung by a thread. It was then that, among the few potential buyers, the name Ford Motor Company entered the discussion. Ford already had a presence in Germany through its subsidiary in Cologne, itself damaged by the war. Henry Ford II, who had taken command after the death of Edsel Ford, was focused on modernizing a weakened company, one that had emerged from the war overshadowed by a strengthened General Motors. He was not looking for uncertain ventures. Ernest Breech, Ford's vice president, led the evaluation. His technical reports were far from encouraging. A design misaligned with American vision, a plant located in politically unstable territory, and a German economy still in ruins. Carl Ludwigsen later recorded the now famous assessment attributed to Ford executives. The project wasn't worth a damn. It was not an impulsive gesture, nor simple arrogance. It was a calculated decision based on the conditions of 1948, high financial risk, growing geopolitical tensions, and more pressing internal priorities. Ford declined. At the time, the decision appeared prudent. No one could clearly foresee the coming economic miracle of West Germany. But that refusal left a vacuum. And that vacuum would ultimately reshape the industrial balance of the second half of the 20th century. Ford's withdrawal did not leave behind a dead factory, but an open question: who would be capable of turning Volkswagen into a real company? In 1948, following Germany's monetary reform and the beginning of a new political chapter in West Germany, the British administration transferred control of the plant to German hands. Ivan Hurst, who had prevented its dismantling, stepped aside. His role had been to preserve the infrastructure. Now it required someone who could turn it into a business. That man was Heinz Nordhoff. Nordhoff was neither an ideologue nor a symbol of the past. He had worked at Opel before the war and understood both engineering and the market. His diagnosis was clear: Volkswagen could not compete by imitating Detroit. It lacked the capital, the scale, and the stability to do so. It had to choose the opposite path: one model, continuous improvement, industrial discipline. While American manufacturers redesigned bodywork every year to stimulate consumption, the Beetle evolved slowly. Every adjustment was technical, not cosmetic. Greater reliability, fewer breakdowns, controlled costs. In post-war Germany, where purchasing power was limited and reconstruction had barely begun, this logic fit perfectly. The Beetle, as it would be known in international markets, offered something more valuable than power: dependability. Exports began early, first to Europe, then, in 1949, to the United States. There, the contrast was almost absurd. In the land of long, chrome-laden, high-powered automobiles, a small, rounded vehicle appeared, with a rear engine and barely 25 horsepower. Yet that difference became its advantage. By the late 1950s, the advertising agency Doyle Dane Bernbach launched a campaign that would redefine automotive marketing: think small. Instead of hiding its modest size, they turned it into the selling point. In a country accustomed to excess, modesty suddenly seemed intelligent. The Beetle ceased to be a foreign car. It became a cultural statement. During the 1960s, while Detroit produced power and flamboyant design, Volkswagen sold mechanical honesty, and the numbers began to speak. In 1972, the Beetle surpassed the car that had inspired its very creation: the Model T, becoming the most produced automobile in history, with over 15 million units assembled. The industrial symbol of defeated Germany had eclipsed the emblem that had defined Fordism itself. But Volkswagen's rise did not occur in isolation. The 1973 oil crisis exposed the vulnerability of the American model built around large, fuel-hungry vehicles. At the same time, Japanese manufacturers such as Toyota and Datsun gained ground with compact, efficient cars. Detroit was beginning to lose the structural advantage it had enjoyed for decades. Volkswagen, meanwhile, was no longer just the Beetle. In 1965, it acquired Auto Union, the foundation of what would become Audi, and began diversifying its portfolio. Later, it would integrate Seat and Škoda, building a group capable of competing across multiple segments. Ford, by contrast, faced plant closures, restructuring, and declining market share in various international markets. There are no official statements in which its executives openly admitted that the 1948 rejection was a historic mistake. But the contrast was evident. The company once dismissed as worthless was becoming a global conglomerate, and its flagship product, the KDF wagon, once conceived as a National Socialist ideological tool, had transformed into one of the greatest industrial successes of 20th century capitalism. The triumph of the Beetle did not close the chapter between the two companies. It deepened it. For decades, Ford and Volkswagen were no longer connected solely by that 1948 decision. They became consistent rivals on showroom floors, in market share battles, in public perception. Two industrial giants measuring strength in an increasingly complex arena. Yet rivalry did not always mean refusing cooperation. In Latin America, they formed an unexpected alliance, Auto Latina. Between 1987 and 1996, they shared platforms, production, and costs in Brazil and Argentina. Two former antagonists collaborating out of necessity in a demanding global environment. With the arrival of the new millennium, however, the rules of the game changed. Volkswagen consolidated its expansion as a multinational group. It absorbed iconic brands: Audi, Porsche, Bentley, Lamborghini, Bugatti. It broadened its segments, conquered emerging markets, and positioned itself as one of the world's largest automotive groups by sales volume. Ford, in contrast, began a painful restructuring. It sold Jaguar, Land Rover, Aston Martin, and Volvo. It closed plants across North America and Europe. It redefined its priorities. For the American giant, the era of expansion had ended. Now the objective was efficiency and survival. In 2008, the financial crisis pushed Detroit to the brink. General Motors and Chrysler collapsed and required government bailouts. Ford managed to avoid bankruptcy without direct federal assistance, but the blow was severe. The traditional American model, large, heavy vehicles dependent on cheap credit, was exposed as fragile and outdated. Volkswagen was not invulnerable either. In 2015, the emissions scandal, known as Dieselgate, revealed questionable corporate practices, fraudulent software, millions of manipulated vehicles, executive resignations, and multi-billion-dollar fines. A deeply uncomfortable moment from which the company has taken years to recover. In the last decade, the energy transition has rewritten the rules once again. Electrification, digitalization, batteries, software, and a new threat: China. BYD, NIO, Geely. Players that barely existed on the global radar 20 years ago, now challenging the established order with massive production volumes, proprietary technology, and strategic subsidies. A common rival that forced old competitors to rethink everything, even to collaborate. Ford announced it would use Volkswagen's MEB electric platform to develop vehicles for the European market. 75 years after rejecting Wolfsburg, the American firm was turning to technology born there in order to navigate the new paradigm. It was not a surrender. It was a sign of the times. Was it a historic mistake not to acquire Volkswagen? With today's perspective, the temptation is to say yes. But in 1948, the factory was in ruins, the German economy was uncertain, and the Cold War was beginning to fracture Europe. Acquiring that asset meant enormous risk. Had Ford absorbed Wolfsburg, the Beetle might never have developed the cultural identity that turned it into a global phenomenon. It might have become a minor line within a corporate catalog. Or perhaps, Ford would have consolidated an industrial dominance impossible to challenge. Ford did not destroy Volkswagen. It did not absorb it. It allowed it to grow. And in that decision, prudent for its time, transformative for the future, the balance of the 20th century automotive industry was shaped. So what do you think about Henry Ford II's decision back in 1948? Did you know about this historical moment that could have reshaped the entire automotive landscape? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if this story captured your attention, you might be interested in discovering how Opel became a pawn of General Motors throughout the 20th century. See you in the next video.